So the absolute greatest threat to a multi-million-dollar, highly trained, heavily armed U.S. fighter pilot who just got shot down behind enemy lines isn't an elite enemy sniper team.
Right.
It's not a fleet of thermal imaging drones, and it's not a heavily armored infantry patrol. It is incredibly a 10-year-old kid with a goat.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds totally absurd on its face, but when you strip away the Hollywood mythology of modern warfare, that is the terrifying dirt-level reality.
Right, because the most advanced technology on the planet can basically be completely undone by a skittish farm animal.
Exactly, and that is the exact kind of reality we have to look at when things go wrong in the air.
And that is exactly what we are exploring today. So, welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this, you are probably used to the sterile, almost surgical perception of modern air combat.
Like a video game.
Yeah, exactly. We picture jets locking onto targets from 50 miles away, a glowing button gets pushed, and this sleek aircraft just glides back to an immaculate runway.
But today, we are shattering that pristine screen. We're looking at what happens when the technology fails.
Right, when the bubble pops. When a pilot is suddenly plunged into a landscape that is just brutally, unforgivingly primal.
Because when a multi-million-dollar asset is reduced to a shower of burning metal over hostile territory, the mission parameters just evaporate.
The only metric of success that matters anymore is human survival.
Right. It's a journey from the absolute pinnacle of aerospace engineering down to the most desperate, gritty acts of human endurance.
So to guide us through this, we are unpacking a highly detailed analytical breakdown of the recent downing of a U.S. F-15E Strike Eagle over Iran.
And our grounding source for this deep dive is this incredibly sobering expert interview with Malcolm Nance.
Right. He's a former U.S. Navy survival instructor and intelligence professional. And this interview is featured on Mario Nawfal's show.
We're going to walk you through the terrifying mechanics of passive missile systems and the violent, bone-crushing physics of high-G ejections.
And, of course, the agonizing reality of survival, evasion, resistance, and escape, what the military calls SRE protocols.
But it is vital to understand that these events do not happen in a vacuum. The pilots flying these missions are operating directly at the intersection of international combat and, well, domestic political rhetoric.
Which actually brings up something I need to state very clearly right at the top for you listening.
Yeah, the political context.
Right. Our source material today contains some highly politically charged commentary regarding U.S. political figures, specifically former President Trump and military leadership, including Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth.
It's important we handle that carefully.
Extremely. So throughout this deep dive, we are going to report impartially on the content provided in the source. Our mission is strictly to convey the ideas, the claims, and the strategic analysis contained in that original interview.
Right. We are not taking sides here.
No, we're absolutely not endorsing any viewpoints. We are just putting the intelligence analysis on the table so you can understand the broader context of these shootdowns.
Because that context is critical. The strategic decisions made in Washington literally dictate the lethal realities these crews face over the Zagros Mountains.
Exactly. So let's get into that reality. The aircraft at the center of this is the F-15E Strike Eagle.
Yeah.
When the news of the shootdown first broke, there was a flurry of confusion on social media. I mean, people were assuming it was an F-35 stealth fighter.
But the source makes a distinct point of clarifying this. The A-15E is absolutely not a stealth aircraft.
No, in fact, Nance refers to it, rather bluntly, as a bomb truck.
And bomb truck is, honestly, the perfect colloquialism for it. I mean, to understand why it was vulnerable, you have to look at the engineering history.
Let's unpack that. Where does the airframe come from?
Well, the fundamental airframe of the F-15 dates back to the mid-1970s. It was designed as an air-to-air superiority fighter, built to go incredibly fast and turn incredibly hard.
But this was the E variant, the Strike Eagle.
Right. It was heavily modified later on. The military essentially took this massive, powerful, older airframe and strapped an enormous amount of external fuel tanks to it.
Conformal fuel tanks, right? Just bolted to the sides.
Exactly. Plus targeting pods and just thousands of pounds of munitions.
So instead of a sleek, invisible jet, you have this hulking, heavy beast loaded with explosives.
Precisely. It is a two-seat strike fighter bomber. You have a pilot in the front seat doing the flying and a weapons systems operator, or WSO, in the back seat.
And the WSO is managing the radar, the targeting cameras, and actually dropping the ordnance.
Right. It is undeniably lethal. but it has the radar cross-section of a flying barn door.
A flying barn door. Wow.
Yeah. And more importantly, for this specific incident, it has a massive thermal signature.
And that thermal signature is exactly what doomed it over southwest Iran. Because the source details that the Iranians didn't use a traditional radar-guided missile to shoot it down.
No, they used an infrared heat-seeking missile system.
And the detail that really, it just made my blood run cold, is that the pilot had absolutely zero warning in the cockpit.
None. Zero. And you have to understand how terrifying that is for a pilot.
Right, because usually they have alarms, don't they?
In modern air combat, pilots are trained to rely on radar warning receivers. RWRs.
How do those work exactly?
If an enemy anti-aircraft battery on the ground turns on its radar and paints your jet to get a firing lock, sensors all over your aircraft detect those radio frequency waves.
So the plane knows it's being looked at.
Exactly. Alarms immediately start blaring in your headset. A screen shows you exactly where the threat is coming from.
Right, you get that frantic beeping sound.
Yeah, and you have precious seconds to dive to the deck, maneuver aggressively, or deploy chaff to confuse the radar. You're in a fight, but you know you are in a fight.
But a passive infrared attack completely bypasses all of that.
Completely. The word passive is the absolute key here.
Because it doesn't emit anything.
Right. A passive system emits absolutely nothing. It doesn't send out a radar ping. It doesn't send out a laser. It just watches.
So imagine an Iranian operator sitting in a concealed position on a ridgeline in the Zagros Mountains.
Yeah, they have a highly magnified thermal imaging camera. They are simply scanning the sky, looking for the immense heat plume generated by the F-15's two giant turbofan engines.
It's basically like standing in a pitch-black field while someone walks around with a massive searchlight.
That's a great way to put it.
You don't have to shine a light on them to know exactly where they are. You just look at the beam they're putting out.
That is exactly it. And a Strike Eagle, especially if it's heavily loaded and pushing hard through the air, burns incredibly hot.
So the operator on the ground just sees this blazing white dot of heat on their thermal screen.
Right. And they use digital software to magnify it. The source actually describes what this looks like from leaked infrared video of these systems.
The green box, yellow box thing, right?
Yes. The operator puts a cursor over the heat source. The software draws a green box around it, and then it shifts to a yellow box as the tracking algorithm locks on.
And once that yellow box forms, the computer essentially tells the missile, hey, do you see this specific heat signature? Go get it.
Exactly. And once the missile leaves the launch rail, it is entirely autonomous. It doesn't need the ground operator anymore.
It's just fire and forget.
Totally. It has its own super-cooled infrared seeker head in the nose, and it just relentlessly chases the hottest thing in the sky. It flies right up the tailpipe of the jet.
Okay, but wait. How does a multi-million-dollar modern warplane not have a way to detect a flaming rocket flying right at it?
It's a shocking vulnerability. But according to the source, the F-15E does not have an integrated infrared warning system installed.
That seems like a massive oversight. Don't newer jets have that?
Oh, absolutely. Modern stealth jets, like the F-35, have distributed aperture systems.
Which is what, exactly?
Basically, hyper-advanced cameras distributed all over the jet that constantly look for the specific thermal bloom of a rocket motor firing.
So the jet sees the launch itself.
Right. If an F-35's computer sees a rocket launch, it automatically spits out flares to distract the missile without the pilot even having to touch a single button.
Wow. And the source actually mentions an F-35 dealing with this.
Yes. The source notes that an F-35 was hit by this exact same type of passive missile just 10 days prior.
But it survived.
It did.
Yeah.
Because of its structural and stealth characteristics and likely its advanced countermeasures, it survived the hit.
But the Strike Eagle crew was completely blind to it.
Completely.
It's like driving a massive roaring 18-wheeler down a dark highway. You have this massive blind spot, and someone standing on an overpass with the night vision goggles drops a cinder block directly onto your engine block.
Yeah, you don't even know they're there.
You were driving along perfectly fine, and a fraction of a second later, your vehicle is literally disintegrating around you.
Disintegrating is the exact right word, because when an infrared missile tracks right up the tailpipe of a jet engine and detonates, the results are catastrophic.
The source refers to this moment, rather grimly, as the "my plane blowy up" process.
Yeah, military gallows humor. But the physics of this transition from controlled flight to a violent high-G ejection are truly horrific.
Let's really dig into that, because I think when you or I picture an ejection, We have this Hollywood image in our heads.
Oh, for sure. Goose from Top Gun. Right, well, maybe not Goose.
Right, right. The pilot pulls a lever, they pop out like a piece of toast, there's a brief, exhilarating roller coaster ride, and then they float gently down on a quiet parachute.
But the source material paints a picture of extreme, brutal violence.
Break that down for us. What happens when you eject?
Ejecting from a supersonic aircraft is one of the most violent physical traumas a human body can survive.
Because the plane is falling apart while you do it.
Exactly. The moment that missile detonates in the engine, the aircraft loses all structural integrity and aerodynamic stability. It stops flying and starts tumbling.
And the source notes that the crew knows instantly that they're out of control.
Yeah, every single warning light on the instrument panel illuminates. Klaxons are screaming in their headsets. The jet might be spinning violently sideways.
And in all that chaos, someone has to make the call to abandon a $50 million jet.
The pilot makes the call. Eject, eject, eject. They reach down and pull the ejection handle, which on modern ACC ejection seats is located centrally between their legs.
And the moment they pull that handle, what happens?
A staggering sequence of explosive events occurs in a matter of milliseconds.
Walk us through those milliseconds.
Yeah.
Because you aren't just opening a door and jumping out.
No, absolutely not. First, explosive cords embedded in the canopy glass above them detonate.
Just blowing the glass to pieces?
Right, shattering the canopy so they don't break their necks hitting it. Simultaneously, straps attached to their legs and torso violently retract.
Why do they retract?
To snap their body into a rigid, locked position. Their head is pulled back against the headrest. If they aren't in perfectly aligned posture, the force of the ejection will literally shatter their spine.
Oh my God. And then the rockets fire.
Solid fuel rockets located under the feet ignite, blasting them out of the cockpit. The source explicitly calls this a 10+G sled ride into space.
Okay, let's translate 10 Gs for the listener.
Yeah.
Because we throw that term around in movies. But what does it actually do to a human body?
Well, 1G is the normal force of gravity you feel sitting in your chair right now. 10 Gs means that instantly your body weighs 10 times its normal amount.
So a 200-pound pilot suddenly feels like they weigh 2,000 pounds.
Yes. 2,000 pounds of crushing force. The blood drains violently from your head, risking instant blackout.
Your heart just can't pump it up to your brain.
Exactly. Your spine compresses, often resulting in permanent microfractures in the vertebrae. Your chest caves in, making it physically impossible to take a breath.
And all of this is happening while you're being punched out into sub-zero air moving at hundreds of miles an hour.
And that's if the jet is intact.
Right. The source points out a deeply chilling variable here. Before you even clear the cockpit rail, you're trying to outrun a massive explosion behind you.
Exactly. When a missile shreds a jet engine, you have thousands of pieces of superheated titanium fan blades, molten aluminum, and missile shrapnel tearing through the fuselage at supersonic speeds.
So the plane itself becomes a fragmentation grenade.
Yeah. The source emphasizes that the crew is at extreme risk of being critically wounded or killed by their own disintegrating aircraft before the parachutes ever even open.
You could be blasted out of the seat with massive puncture wounds, already bleeding out as you fly through the air.
It happens.
Now, in this specific incident over Iran, the source confirms that both the pilot and the WSO successfully initiated ejection.
Right. The Iranians actually released the thermal footage of the shootdown, and you can see two distinct white-hot plumes separating from the exploding aircraft.
But this leads to a huge logistical nightmare on the ground. If they punch out of the same plane at basically the exact same time, why do they end up separated?
Because of the violent physics of time and space, they do not eject at the exact same millisecond.
If they did, they'd hit each other, right?
Exactly. If they did, their rocket-propelled seats would collide in midair, killing them both. The system is mechanically sequenced so that the WSO fires a fraction of a second before the front seat.
So imagine firing 2 bullets from a moving train. Even if you pull the triggers a half second apart, if that train is moving at 600 miles an hour, those 2 bullets are going to land vastly far apart.
That is a brilliant analogy. The Strike Eagle is moving at hundreds of miles an hour when they pull the handle. That fraction of a second delay means their launch points in the sky are entirely different.
And then you have to factor in the altitude.
Right. They might be falling for tens of thousands of feet. As they fall, they are subjected to violent upper atmospheric winds, completely different jet streams, and the unpredictable drift of their parachutes.
So they don't just land in the same field.
No, absolutely not. They can land on opposite sides of a mountain range. They could be separated by miles of jagged, hostile terrain, completely unable to see each other.
With no visual line of sight whatsoever.
None. And remember the physical toll we just talked about. One or both of them might be hanging in their parachute unconscious, concussed, or bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds.
And while they're floating down trying to just assess if all their limbs are still attached, the enemy on the ground is already doing the math.
Yes.
Because the Iranians don't just blindly wander into the desert looking for them.
The enemy is highly methodical. The source breaks down the immediate ground tactics used by Iranian forces. The first thing they do is drive straight toward the massive burning crater where the jet impacted.
And from there, they start reverse engineering the ejection.
Exactly. They don't look for the parachutes first. They look for the ejection seats.
Because you don't ride the seat all the way to the ground.
Right. The seat's only job is to get you out of the fireball. It rockets you clear, deploys a small drogue parachute to stabilize your violent tumbling, and then...
It just drops away.
Yeah, at a preset altitude determined by barometric sensors, the heavy seat physically unclips from your harness and drops away like a rock. You continue down on your main canopy.
So the enemy finds this massive, heavy metal seat smashed into the rocks.
They find the seat, they look at the wind direction, they calculate the altitude of the explosion, and they draw a geometric search grid.
They know exactly which sector to send their patrols to find where the fragile human actually landed.
Exactly. They have a massive head start.
Which brings us to the moment the pilot's boots actually hit the dirt. The source is absolutely emphatic about this. The second they touch the ground, a profound psychological paradigm shift has to occur.
It is the absolute core philosophy drilled into them at the military's SEER school.
Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape.
Right, which is headquartered up in Spokane, Washington. The moment they unclip from that parachute, they have to mentally kill the pilot.
Kill the pilot. What does that mean in practice?
It means their job of flying a multi-million-dollar technological marvel is over. They have a brand new, singular identity, and it is entirely primitive.
Survivor-evader.
Survivor-evader. You are no longer the apex predator of the sky. You are prey.
That is an incredibly heavy mental burden to shoulder when you are alone, in the dark, and potentially severely injured.
It is.
But they aren't totally defenseless, right? Let's unpack the actual gear they have on them. Because you don't just fall out of the sky in a fire-retardant jumpsuit with your car keys in your pocket.
No, you carry a staggering amount of specialized gear, and it's distributed very specifically.
Where is it all kept?
First, you have what you are physically wearing. The Aircrew Life Support, or ALS vest. This is strapped incredibly tight to your torso.
And what's inside that?
It holds the absolute immediate necessities if everything else goes wrong. You've got a water bladder, maybe a quarter canteen of actual water, what they call Scooby snacks.
Scooby snacks. Like the cartoon.
Yeah, it's slang for highly dense caloric survival food. And your immediate close-range communication gear.
But the bulk of the heavy survival gear isn't in their pockets. It drops with them.
Exactly. When the heavy ejection seat falls away from the pilot, a fiberglass container called the seat pan, which they were literally sitting on in the cockpit stays, attached to their harness.
How does it stay attached?
Via a long nylon lanyard. As they float down on their parachute, this seat pan drops and hangs about 20 or 30 feet below them.
What's the engineering logic behind having it hang below them? Why not just wear it as a backpack?
Weight and impact. If you had an extra 60 pounds of gear strapped to your legs when you hit the ground at 15 miles an hour under a parachute, you would shatter your ankles or your femurs.
Oh, that makes total sense.
Right. By hanging it on a lanyard, the seat pan hits the ground first, it takes the impact, the lanyard goes slack, and the pilot lands a second later completely unburdened.
That is brilliant engineering. Okay, so they land, they pull the lanyard in. What exactly is inside this seat pan?
It is basically a clown car of survival equipment. It contains an inflatable yellow life raft because when you eject, the system has no idea if you are falling over the snow-capped Zagros Mountains or plunging into the Persian Gulf.
Better to have it and not need it.
Exactly. It has shark repellent, water purification tablets, medical trauma kits, a wire saw for cutting brush, extra cold weather gear, and crucially, their heavy weaponry.
Let's talk about the weaponry. Because the source notes they carry a standard issue sidearm.
Usually an M17 or M18 9mm handgun with a 30-round extended magazine.
But they also carry a long gun in that seat pan. the GAU-5 Aircrew Survival Rifle.
It's a fascinating piece of engineering. The GAU-5 is essentially a specialized, modified M4 assault rifle.
But obviously you can't fit a standard 3-foot rifle inside a tiny seed pan.
No, so it is designed with a quick detach barrel and a folding pistol grip. It breaks down into 2 compact pieces.
And the pilot just puts it together in the field.
The pilot pulls it out, clicks the barrel into place, and suddenly they have a fully functional 5.56 assault rifle, complete with 4 30-round magazines.
Wait, I have to challenge the logic of this.
Go ahead.
We just established that their new job title is Survivor Evader. Their entire goal is to be a ghost. Why on earth is the military dropping them behind enemy lines with an assault rifle and 120 rounds of ammunition?
It does seem counterintuitive.
If you fire an M4 in the quiet mountains of Iran, you are going to draw every enemy patrol within a 5-mile radius straight to your location. It seems entirely counterproductive to evasion.
You are absolutely right. If an evader is pulling the trigger on that GAU-5, their evasion has failed catastrophically.
So it's not for fighting their way out.
The firepower is strictly, unequivocally a last resort. The military doctrine isn't giving them a rifle so they can fight a one-man war against the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Then what is the scenario where they actually use it?
The extraction phase.
When the helicopters arrive.
Right. Imagine you have successfully hidden for 3 days. The rescue helicopters are inbound. You are finally moving from your hiding spot to the landing zone. But the enemy has figured out what is happening, and they are closing in on you.
You need to keep them back.
You need the ability to lay down heavy suppressing fire for the final 60 seconds to keep the enemy's heads down while you sprint up the ramp of the helicopter.
So it's a break contact weapon.
It is for breaking contact and surviving the final, most vulnerable moments of a hot extraction. But during the evasion phase itself, firing that weapon is practically a death sentence.
Which means the true weapons of evasion are silence and camouflage.
Absolutely.
The source outlines the immediate, visceral, physical actions a pilot must take the second they finish unpacking that gear. You check yourself for massive arterial bleeding, obviously, but then you have to deal with the parachute.
You have to imagine the visual footprint of a parachute.
Right, it's huge.
You have just floated down on a massive, bright white, orange, and green canopy. It might be draped over the top of a tree. It is a giant neon sign pointing directly to your location.
So what do you do with it?
The very first tactical task is to gather up dozens of yards of nylon, stuff it into a rocky crevice, or physically dig a hole and bury it entirely.
You have to scrub the landing zone of any evidence you were ever there.
Exactly. And then you start altering your own physical appearance.
The source mentions taking off the high-tech flight helmet and throwing on a simple beanie. Why trade a ballistic helmet for a knit cap?
Because a military flight helmet creates a highly distinct, unnatural silhouette against a ridgeline.
Oh, because of the shape.
Right. Human eyes are hardwired to recognize the shape of a head and shoulders. A beanie breaks up the hard geometry of your skull, making you look more like a rock or a stump in the dark.
And then comes the face paint.
Yes. They pull out tubes of camouflage paint and must immediately smear it over every inch of exposed skin.
Their face, their neck, their hands.
Even the whites of your eyelids, the inside of your ears. The shine of your skin reflects ambient moonlight. Once that paint is on, the transformation is complete.
You are no longer a pilot. You are a ghost trying to disappear into the dirt.
And the CERA instructors pound one vital psychological rule into their heads before they ever fly. You never, under any circumstances, surrender to the elements.
Never give up to nature.
It is the bedrock of survival psychology. You do not surrender because you are freezing cold, because you haven't eaten in 4 days, or because you have a broken collarbone.
You just keep going.
There are only 3 acceptable outcomes to an evasion. You are successfully rescued, you successfully evade across a friendly border, or you are physically, violently captured by enemy forces overpowering you.
But you do not raise your hands and walk out of the bush just because you are uncomfortable.
Never.
This brings us to what I found to be the most fascinating and honestly the most expectation-shattering part of this entire deep dive.
The move.
Yeah. We all have this ingrained cinematic image of what being behind enemy lines looks like. We picture the pilot sprinting through a dense pine forest, jumping over logs, dodging searchlights, constantly on the move.
Like Harrison Ford in The Fugitive.
Exactly. But the source makes it clear that the gritty reality of real-world evasion is agonizingly, painfully slow.
It is the exact antithesis of an action movie. Moving fast means you are breathing heavily. It means you are breaking dry branches.
And making noise.
It means you are displacing rocks and creating a visual disturbance in the environment. Evaders are taught to move almost exclusively under the cover of total darkness.
And when they do move, the source says they move like molasses. What does that mean, practically?
It means they might spend 6 hours in the pitch black just to move 2 or 3 kilometers.
6 hours for 2 kilometers. That's insane.
Every single footstep is calculated. You gently place the toe of your boot down, feel for dry leaves or twigs, and slowly roll your weight onto your heel to ensure total silence.
And when the sun comes up,
You cease all movement entirely. You find a patch of thick briar brush, a shallow cave, or you literally use your bare hands to dig a shallow trench into the dirt.
just burying yourself.
You crawl inside, you pull vegetation over yourself, and you do not move a single muscle for the next 14 hours.
So you are lying in the dirt, terrified to even breathe. You would think the greatest threat to you in that moment would be a highly trained Iranian tracking unit with thermal drones or bloodhounds.
But it's not.
No. The source specifically highlights that the most dangerous, compromising element in the entire theater of war is kids with goats.
Kids with goats. I know it sounds almost comical until you break down the sensory psychology of the environment.
Let's do that, because I kept thinking it's like trying to sneak through someone's backyard in the pitch dark.
Exactly.
You might be a Navy SEAL, you might have $40,000 night vision goggles, and you might be wearing the best camouflage in the world. But the homeowner who has lived there for 30 years knows exactly where the squeaky floorboard on the patio is.
They know every inch of it.
The local kid knows when a single rock by the creek has been turned over.
That is a phenomenal way to understand it. Local awareness trumps technological stealth every single time.
And goats are a huge part of that.
In the mountainous terrain of the Middle East and South Asia, goats are ubiquitous. And goats are highly observant, incredibly skittish prey animals. They survive by noticing when something in their environment is slightly wrong.
So the evader is dug into a bush, completely motionless, but a herd of goats wanders by.
The goats approach the brush. They smell the lingering scent of jet fuel or sweat or the chemical face paint. Or they simply notice that a pile of leaves doesn't look quite right.
And what do?
The goat doesn't investigate, it just reacts. It suddenly jumps back, bleats loudly, and the whole herd scatters.
And the shepherd, who is often just a 12-year-old kid sitting up in a nearby tree eating lunch, sees his flock suddenly spook.
Exactly. The kid knows his flock intimately. He knows they don't spook at the wind. He knows something foreign is hiding in that specific patch of brush.
So he doesn't need a thermal camera. The goats just gave you away.
And just like that, the evader is compromised. The kid runs back to the village, tells his father, who tells the local militia, and an hour later, an armed patrol is surrounding your hiding spot.
The source references a very famous historical case to underscore the psychological endurance required here. The shootdown of Captain Scott O'Grady, call sign Basher 52, over Bosnia in 1995.
Yes, O'Grady's evasion is absolutely legendary in Surrey communities. He was on the ground for 6 days.
6 days, just hiding.
He was eating bugs, drinking rainwater out of a sponge from his survival kit. But the most terrifying detail of his evasion was the proximity of the enemy.
How close were they?
He had to lie perfectly still in a shallow depression in the dirt, while Serbian soldiers were walking literally inches from his head.
Imagine the sensory overload of that. You are covered in dirt, your heart is pounding so hard you think they can hear it, and you're listening to the boots of enemy soldiers crunching the leaves right next to your face.
The sheer mental fortitude required to not flinch, to not jump up and run, is unimaginable.
And that is why movement during the day is strictly forbidden. If you are pinned down by a kid with a goat or a patrol walking by, you have to endure it.
You freeze and you endure it.
But if they are completely immobile, hiding in a hole in the ground, how on earth do they ever coordinate a rescue without giving away their position? I mean, if you yell for help, you're dead.
Right.
That brings us to their only lifeline back to the world, the PRC-112G.
The PRC-112G is an absolute marvel of survival technology. It is their primary method of communication.
What does it look like?
It looks like a thick, heavy green brick of a radio. But what it does inside is incredibly advanced.
Because it's not just a walkie-talkie where you hold down a button and say, hey guys, I'm stuck on a mountain, come get me.
If you keyed an open microphone and broadcast your voice like that, enemy signals intelligence would triangulate your radio frequency and have a mortar round dropped on your head within minutes.
So how does the PRC-112G avoid that?
By primarily acting as an encrypted burst transmission satellite-based GPS device.
How does burst transmission protect them?
Instead of a continuous wave of radio energy, the moment the pilot activates the beacon, the radio compresses a highly encrypted data packet containing their exact GPS coordinates.
Okay.
It fires that data packet in a microsecond, bursts straight up into the atmosphere to an L-band satellite orbiting the Earth.
So it's too fast for the enemy to track.
Exactly. The satellite catches it, bounces it down to a secure military server, and routes it directly to the Combat Search and Rescue, or CSR Task Force.
The CSR task force.
Yeah.
These are the people whose entire existence in a war zone is just sitting in a ready room waiting for that specific digital ping.
Precisely. They have computer systems loaded with the precise identification and biometric details of every single pilot flying a mission that day.
So when that ping hits the screen,
They know exactly who is down and within meters of where they are. And the most critical feature of the PRC-112G is its two-way text capability over that satellite link.
so they don't even have to speak. They can text. What is CSR texting a pilot hiding in a bush?
The very first question is always status. They'll text, "Are you green? What is your physical condition? Are you 100% healthy, 50%?
They need to know what they're dealing with.
Right. Are you ambulatory, meaning can you walk? Or do we need to bring a stretcher?
And they can coordinate movement without making a sound.
Right. CSR is looking at high-resolution satellite imagery of the pilot's exact location. They can text specific tactical instructions tailored to the terrain,
Like what?
like, do not move north, there is a highway. Move on a bearing of 240 degrees for exactly 800 meters. Find the dry riverbed and dig in.
And do they just keep texting back and forth all night?
No, they establish a rigid communication schedule to preserve the radio's battery and minimize the risk of the enemy detecting the satellite bursts.
So it's the old, don't call us, we'll call you routine.
Exactly. Turn the radio entirely off, turn it back on in exactly 4 hours and 15 minutes, and we will send the next instruction.
The source also mentions a vital piece of the puzzle orbiting high above the battlefield, a Pathfinder aircraft.
Yes, typically a heavily modified C-130 Combat Talon. This aircraft flies in a high-altitude orbit, acting as the ultimate quarterback for the rescue.
What's its job?
It is scooping up the satellite texts from the pilot, relaying them down to the rescue helicopters that are spinning up on the tarmac, and coordinating with fighter jets to provide air cover.
But here is where the pristine technology collides with the terrifying reality of human deception, the authentication process.
Oh, yeah. This is critical.
Because the CSR team knows they have a ping from a radio, but they have to be absolutely certain who is holding that radio.
This is arguably the most nerve-wracking part of the entire protocol. CSR cannot simply assume that because a radio says it's the pilot, it's actually the pilot.
Why not?
Because of the threat of a ambush, a surface-to-air missile ambush.
How did that work?
The enemy's tactical playbook includes finding the downed pilot, killing or capturing them, taking the PRC-112G, and using it to text CSR themselves.
So they pretend to be the pilot.
Right. They lure the massive, slow-moving rescue helicopters into a specific valley, and then open up on them with hidden anti-aircraft guns.
So how do you prove you are who you say you are, while whispering into a brick in the middle of hostile territory?
You do it through the isolated personnel card, often called an ISO-prep.
What's on an ISO-prep?
Before a pilot ever steps foot on a flight line, they sit in a secure room and fill out a highly classified dossier. It contains their specific call signs, because they never use their real names on the radio, and a list of hyper-specific personal authentication questions.
Stuff you couldn't possibly guess or interrogate out of someone quickly.
Exactly. What was the name of your first dog? What street did you live on in 3rd grade? Describe the specific shape of the scar on your left knee.
So CSR will ask these over the text or secure voice.
Yes. CSR will ask these questions over secure channels. The pilot must answer flawlessly.
And even after all that, when the rescue team actually gets there.
The source notes that even when the rescue team physically lands, sprints through the dirt, and puts their hands on the pilot, the very first thing the medic does is pull out a physical copy of that card, shine a red flashlight in their face, and ask those questions again.
Just to be absolutely sure.
They check biometrics if necessary. They have to guarantee they aren't loading an Iranian intelligence operative wearing a stolen flight suit onto their helicopter.
But let me ask you about the nightmare scenario. What if the pilot's brain is scrambled?
Oh.
We just talked about them pulling 10 Gs. What if they suffered a massive concussion during the ejection or smashed their head on a rock when they landed, and they literally cannot remember how to operate the complex encryption menus on the radio?
It happens.
Or what if the radio took a piece of shrapnel and the satellite uplink is just broken?
That is the scenario that keeps Siri instructors awake at night. If the encrypted digital burst fails, the PRC-112G is designed to fall back to unencrypted, open voice channels.
Meaning anyone can hear it.
It essentially becomes a very powerful, old-school walkie-talkie. You tune it to the international distress frequency, usually 243.0 megahertz, and you just start talking.
But the moment you broadcast your voice on an open frequency,
You light up the electronic spectrum like a flare in the night sky. And the source specifically highlights a grim reality here. It isn't just the local Iranian militia listening.
I was listening.
Russian intelligence systems, which provide heavy electronic warfare support to Iran, are constantly scanning those open frequencies.
So everyone hears it at once.
If a concussed pilot gets on the radio and says, "Mayday, I'm down," the race begins instantly. The U.S. Pathfinder aircraft hears it, but the Russian and Iranian signal intelligence units hear it too.
They can triangulate where the signal's coming from.
They triangulate the signal, and it becomes a brutal foot race to see who can get to the coordinates first.
And that leads us directly into the absolute chaos of the recovery phase. Because the source material details that in this specific shootdown, the two crew members experienced vastly different types of rescues.
Night and day.
Let's break down the recovery of the front seat pilot first. He was rescued via what the military calls a daylight conventional recovery.
Which is a phrase that makes every combat rescue pilot cringe. The source emphasizes that daylight conventional rescues are incredibly rare and exceptionally dangerous.
Why is the sunlight such a massive liability?
Because of the nature of the rescue vehicles, HH-60 Plavehawk helicopters are massive, loud, and relatively slow.
They aren't stealth choppers.
No. Flying them deep into hostile territory in broad daylight gives every enemy soldier with a rifle the ability to track them visually. To authorize a daylight mission, the CISR commanders had to have absolutely perfect intelligence.
They couldn't just go in blind hoping to find him.
No. They likely had a stealth drone, maybe an RQ-170, orbiting high above, physically laying eyes on the pilot's hiding spot through a camera.
Planning out the exact route.
Intelligence officers would have meticulously mapped out a specific ingress route, flying low through valleys to mask the helicopters from radar, and scrubbing the entire flight path to ensure the Iranians hadn't parked modal anti-aircraft guns along the route.
But even with all that meticulous planning, the source details that it was an incredibly violent extraction.
Extremely violent. The reality of daytime flying is that you can't hide from the locals.
Even random people on the street.
Right. The source explicitly mentions that as the two Pavehawk rescue helicopters were flying low over highways to get to the pilot, local Iranian highway cops simply pulled over, grabbed AK-47s out of their trunks, and started dumping magazines into the sky.
Highway cops with AKs just shooting at U.S. helicopters.
The helicopters took battle damage, and crew members inside were actually wounded by ground fire.
And to survive that gauntlet and actually land, the U.S. doesn't just send in 2 lone helicopters, do they? They bring in an apocalyptic amount of firepower.
The source uses the phrase, bringing the dam down on him. If they're committing to a daylight extraction in a hot zone, they build a physical wall of lead around the pilot.
What kind of assets are we talking about?
We are talking about deploying Army DP's direct action penetrator Blackhawks. These are helicopters where they have completely stripped out the passenger space in the back and loaded them exclusively with Hellfire missiles, 30mm chain guns, and rocket pods.
They're essentially flying gunships.
Exactly. They will also bring in AC-130 gunships orbiting above, raining down 105mm artillery shells, and Reaper drones providing constant overwatch.
To just paralyze everyone on the ground.
The strategy is to completely paralyze the enemy. They lay down such overwhelming, suppressing fire that no enemy soldier within 2 miles dares to lift their head out of the dirt.
And under that umbrella of fire, the rescue helicopter touches down. And a pararescue jumper, which is essentially an elite airborne trauma surgeon with a machine gun, sprints out the back.
They grab the pilot.
They haul them up the ramp, and the entire armada violently blasts its way back out of the country.
Yeah.
That is the conventional brute force route.
Yes.
But the weapons systems operator, the guy who ejected miles away, he wasn't recovered in that massive daylight raid. He required a completely different, unconventional recovery.
This is where we shift from brute force to absolute stealth. While the loud, explosive daylight rescue is happening for the pilot, the WSO is still dug in, still evading.
So no helicopters for him?
Unconventional recoveries do not involve fleets of helicopters. They rely entirely on highly classified assets that are already quietly operating on the ground behind enemy lines.
The source paints a very vivid, almost surreal picture of this involving special forces.
It's a fascinating insight into deep reconnaissance. Imagine a small 12-man special forces team that has been infiltrated into the Iranian mountains weeks before the conflict even started.
Just hiding there.
Their job is simply to watch. They are living in concealed sniper hide, operating in total, absolute silence.
The sensory details the source provides here are incredible.
They are. To avoid giving away their position, they don't start fires. They survive by drinking cold MRE milkshakes.
Cold MRE milkshakes.
And they manage their bodily waste using chemical poopy bags so they don't leave biological trace evidence. They are ghosts.
And suddenly, their encrypted radio hums to life.
Right. They receive a burst transmission from command. A downed U.S. aviator is 22 kilometers to your southeast. Abort your primary reconnaissance mission. Break camp, maneuver stealthily to his coordinates, and execute a recovery.
So they have to hike to him.
They pack up their hide and begin a highly tactical, silent movement through enemy territory to find him.
What happens at the exact moment they make contact with the evading WSO?
Yeah.
Because I imagine a pilot hiding in a bush is going to be incredibly jumpy when heavily armed men suddenly appear in the dark.
It is a highly choreographed moment. The pilot will have been texted via their PRC-112G to expect friendlies from a specific direction and to remain absolutely still.
Who approaches him first?
When the Special Forces team reaches the brush, the first person to make physical contact is usually the A-10 Delta. That's the team's Special Forces medic.
And they do the ID check.
They immediately do the authentication check we discussed. Once verified, they do a rapid trauma assessment.
And then the pilot status changes entirely.
They become what the operators call a special package. They are no longer an independent evader.
What does that mean practically?
The source describes how an operator might literally take a heavy-duty carabiner and clip the pilot's harness directly to their own belt.
Literally tethering them together.
The message is simple. You belong to me now. You step exactly where I step. You move when I move. They integrate the pilot into the center of their patrol formation and exfiltrate them silently on foot.
The source also drops a detail about an even more covert civilian-style option for these unconventional rescues.
Yes, and this involves the darkest corners of the intelligence community. It might not be a heavily armed special forces team that comes to get you.
Who could it be?
It could be deep cover CIA assets or allied intelligence networks operating within the local population.
How does that play out?
You are hiding in a ditch near a highway. Suddenly, a beat-up Toyota Corolla taxi pulls over.
Just a normal car.
The driver steps out, walks to the ditch, and uses the authentication code word. It's a local civilian asset. They throw you in the back seat.
And they have to get rid of the uniform.
Right. They immediately strip off your military flight suit and force you into local clothing.
What?
A shalwar kameez, sandals, maybe a keffiyeh to hide your face.
And then they just drive off.
Then they simply drive you away. They use their local knowledge to navigate bypasses, or they use bribe money to get through Iranian highway checkpoints, ultimately driving you to a blank spot in the desert where a clandestine aircraft can quietly land in the dark and whisk you away.
Okay, I have to pause here and look at the sheer mathematics of what we've just discussed. Look at the risk calculus.
It's massive.
For the pilot, you are risking 2 Pavehawk helicopters. You have crew members actively taking AK-47 fire and bleeding. For the WSO, you're compromising a highly valuable special forces team deep behind enemy lines, or risking the lives and covers of local intelligence assets.
Right.
You are risking dozens of elite, highly trained lives to save one single person. From an economic spreadsheet perspective, that math makes absolutely no sense.
If you look at it purely as an accounting exercise, it is completely irrational. You are risking 50 lives and $1 billion in assets to recover one guy.
Yep.
But the military doctrine isn't based on economics.
It's based on a moral contract.
It is based on a fundamental moral contract. Think about what we ask these pilots to do.
Fly into extreme danger.
We ask them to strap into a flying bomb, fly hundreds of miles into hostile airspace, and face anti-aircraft fire to do the nation's bidding. The only way a human being can mentally process that risk and still push the throttle forward is if they possess an absolute, unshakable faith in one rule.
We do not abandon anyone.
We do not abandon anyone out there. If you fall out of the sky, you have to know in your bones that the entire weight and fury of the United States military will move heaven and earth to come get you.
It supersedes logic.
It is a moral imperative that supersedes logic. If you break that contract, the entire psychological foundation of the Air Force crumbles.
That is incredibly profound. Let's zoom out now and look at the broader strategic picture. Because this deep dive isn't just about one isolated F-15E. The source details that a massive, coordinated escalation occurred on the very same day.
Yes, the source paints a picture of a coordinated air defense trap. Roughly 500 nautical miles south of the Zagros Mountains, down near the strategic Strait of Hormuz, the U.S. was flying A-10 Warthogs.
And the A-10 is totally different from an F-15.
The A-10 is a heavily armored attack aircraft designed to fly low and slow to support troops on the ground.
And the Iranians were waiting for them.
The source confirms that an A-10 was shot down by a MANPADS.
What's a MANPADS?
A man-portable air defense system. Essentially, a soldier standing on the ground with a shoulder-launched heat-seeking missile similar to an American Stinger.
And it wasn't just one A-10.
Not only was one A-10 destroyed, but a second A-10 sustained heavy battle damage and barely managed to limp back to a friendly base for a crash landing.
And this was entirely separate from the F-15E rescue mission.
Entirely separate. Which brings up a concept the source jokingly refers to as Nance's law of intelligent kismet.
Intelligent kismet.
The old intelligence adage is that once is happenstance, twice is a coincidence, but coincidence takes a hell of a lot of planning.
Right. You don't lose an F-15E in the mountains, have an A-10 blown out of the sky over the strait, heavily damage a second A-10, and have 2 rescue helicopters shot up by highway cops all on the exact same afternoon just because of bad luck.
It wasn't luck at all. The expert analysis provided in the source is that the Iranians demonstrated remarkable strategic patience.
Because they had these missiles for a while.
They had these cheap, lethal, shoulder-launched missiles distributed to their forces for weeks, but they held their fire. They didn't take pot shots at high-altitude fighter jets where they knew they would miss and give away their positions.
They waited for the right moment.
They waited specifically until the U.S. military felt comfortable enough to bring in their low-altitude, slow-moving aircraft like the A-10s and the helicopters, and then they sprung the trap.
Coordinated surface-to-air missile ambushes. Sambushes.
A theater-wide execution of sambushes.
This brings us to the political context provided by Malcolm Nance in the source material. But again, I want to reiterate to you listening that we are strictly impartially reporting the claims and analysis made by the source in this interview.
We are just unpacking the argument Nance makes.
Exactly. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, but they are crucial for understanding Nance's argument about why this happened when it did. Nance draws a direct, critical line between domestic political hubris in Washington and these lethal outcomes on the battlefield.
Yes, the source makes a very pointed critique of the current administration's rhetoric colliding with tactical reality. Nance highlights a timeline.
What happened on that timeline?
Just hours before these coordinated shootdowns occurred, former President Trump, reportedly relying on briefings from his Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, publicly declared that the United States had achieved total air dominance over the region.
And total air dominance isn't just a political buzzword, is it? It's a specific doctrinal military term.
It implies a permissive environment. As the source explains, it implies a situation akin to the later years of the war in Afghanistan, where U.S. aircraft could fly at any altitude, at any speed, loiter for hours, and conduct missions without any substantial fear of sophisticated anti-aircraft threats.
But the reality on the ground was very different.
Nance argues that this public declaration of invulnerability was violently contradicted by the Iranians, demonstrating they could swat multiple U.S. aircraft out of the sky in a single afternoon.
Nance also gets highly personal regarding Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, raising specific allegations about his background and his structural changes to the military.
The source outlines several deeply critical claims. Nance alleges that Hegseth bears white supremacist tattoos.
He mentions specific symbols, right?
Specifically referencing Crusader iconography and anti-Muslim symbols, and claims this was the reason he was previously removed from serving in the D.C. National Guard.
And he criticizes Hegseth's actions as secretary, too.
Furthermore, the source heavily criticizes Hegseth's administrative actions, specifically the firing of senior seasoned military generals.
What is Nance's strategic argument regarding those firings? Why does he think that matters to a pilot in Iran?
Nance argues that Hegseth is dismissing experienced, merit-based, battle-tested leaders out of desire to reshape the top echelon of the military to fit a specific ideological or aesthetic mold.
So he's saying it's politically motivated, not tactical.
The overarching argument laid out in the source is that this chaotic leadership style is leading to unpredictable, dangerous military directives.
The source mentions erratic communication, right? Like specific tweets.
Yes, noting instances like tweeting "God is with us" and issuing sudden, fluctuating orders regarding highly provocative maneuvers, like attempting to seize Iranian islands like Karg Island.
Which just escalates the situation.
Nance's ultimate conclusion is that this combination of dismissive political rhetoric, unpredictable directives, and the purging of seasoned military leadership creates a highly dangerous vacuum.
It ignores the actual threat.
It creates an environment where the brutal tactical reality on the ground, the fact that the enemy is heavily armed, disciplined, and highly capable, is being ignored in favor of domestic political posturing.
So, to summarize the tactical reality, despite having a trillion-dollar defense budget and the most technologically advanced military in human history, the rules of engagement for an entire theater of war were effectively rewritten in one afternoon by guys hiding in pickup trucks with cheap, shoulder-launched missiles.
That is the brutal truth of it.
What is the immediate practical consequence of this for the pilots flying tomorrow?
The immediate consequence is the absolute end of low-altitude dominance. The U.S. can no longer fly A-10s, helicopters, or low-level bombing runs without accepting an extreme, almost prohibitive level of risk.
Because everyone is waiting for them.
As the source bluntly summarizes it, everyone and their dog is waiting on the ground with a heat-seeking missile. U.S. aircraft will be forced to retreat back to high altitudes, dropping precision bombs from 30,000 feet, which completely changes how close air support and reconnaissance are conducted. It fundamentally changes the war.
It is a massive strategic shift triggered by passive sensors and gravity. As we wrap up this deep dive, let's just pause and reflect on the incredible visceral journey we've just unpacked.
It's a lot to take in.
We started in the high-tech, multi-million-dollar sterile cockpit of an F-15E Strike Eagle. We rode through the violent, bone-crushing physics of a 10G ejection seat blasting through a shattered canopy.
And we landed in the freezing Burt.
Exploring the primitive, terrifying reality of a highly trained pilot smearing paint on their face, hiding in a bush, and praying that a 12-year-old shepherd's goat doesn't give away their position.
It is a stark, necessary reminder. Beneath all the radar-absorbing stealth coatings, beneath the satellite uplinks and the thermal cameras, war ultimately distills down to human grit, endurance, and the primal will to survive when the miraculous technology fails.
It strips away that video game view of modern warfare entirely. But looking at the sheer cost of this, the billions of dollars in lost airframes, the shattered spines, the millions spent on complex rescue armadas, it leaves me with a lingering provocative thought.
What's that?
Something that wasn't directly addressed in the source, but seems like the inevitable conclusion of this entire scenario. As anti-aircraft technology like these passive infrared sensors becomes incredibly cheap to produce, widely distributed, and highly lethal,
Right.
and as the cost of these combat search and rescue missions becomes so massive, both in terms of deploying multi-million-dollar helicopters and the immense risk to elite human lives, are we approaching a breaking point?
In what way?
Are we entering an era where human pilots simply become too much of a liability to put in the sky over contested airspace at all? If the absolute most dangerous, costly, and politically sensitive part of a bombing mission is rescuing the human being who pulled the trigger, will the future of close air support belong entirely to disposable, soulless drones?
It's a chilling question. When the recovery of the pilot costs more in blood and treasure than the tactical value of the asset they were flying, the human element becomes the weak link in the chain of modern warfare.
Something for you to mull over as you go about your day.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you on the next one.